Okay, hey guys, Paul here. So today I wanted to talk about Tier 0 decks or formats in Yu-Gi-Oh! And what I think of them, share some thoughts, what they are, whether or not they even exist. And yeah, I think this is a really relevant discussion since the Sprite and Tier Element decks are just now releasing into the TCG and they're expected to be these very big, scary Tier 0 decks. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what those are. So, a Tier 0 deck is kind of a nebulous term, but people typically define it as a deck that is far and away stronger and more represented than anything else in the current format. As you guys know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks are kind of like agreed to be like in tiers. Like there's like Tier 1 decks, which are the best decks in the format. There's like Tier 2, there's Tier 3. Some people have things like Tier 1.5. Not here to get into the specifics of that, but the Tier 0 deck is supposed to be the deck that is like, the SS plus tier. It is far and away better than everything else underneath it. And some people also have defined it as like a deck that makes up more than 65% of representation at events. You could argue, some different numbers there, whether or not does that mean like representation at the event in total, representation in the top cut of an event, whatever. Yeah, the point is, Tier 0 decks are decks to beat. They're the big bad deck of the format, and we might have one around the corner since the Tier Element and Sprite decks did really, really well and overtook the OCG's metagame. It looks like that might happen here. Now, a brief history of Tier 0 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I think that the big one that comes to mind for a lot of people, or at least one of the first major ones, was Teledad in 2008, 2009, and that sort of period of time. It was the deck with like Dark Arm Dragon, Emergency Teleport, Elmotero Stratos. There were other key cards in there. Very expensive deck, very powerful deck. Took lots of spots at what were at the time SJC championships or Shonen Jump championships. Now they're called YCS events. But yeah, Teledad is like a very infamous example of what people kind of point to when they think of a Tier 0 deck. Another really good example is probably the Dragon Ruler deck in 2013. These monsters were incredibly powerful and all pretty much found their way on the ban list in some form or fashion at different times. And even to this day, it's something that like people kind of revere the power of Dragon Rulers. If Dragon Rulers were to come back, would they destroy the game now? Should the Dragon Rulers come back yet? There's always a discussion around that. And this deck was extremely powerful. It just had, a lot of recursion, very powerful monsters, insanely fast and reliable like setups, and just kind of overpowered nearly everything else in the format. Let's see, what else? Nekroz in 2015, that was the Ritual deck. So extremely consistent, more consistent than we'd really seen in any Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck at the time. Had access to just really strong boss monsters, strong removal, that Djinn releaser of Rituals, that monster. There was sort of a Djinn lock that could completely shut your opponent out from special summoning. It was kind of a shorter-lived Tier 0 deck. I think it got hit on the ban list a little soon after, but I don't remember exactly. And then probably the most recent example would be Zodiacs in 2017, which was a very ubiquitous deck. The Zodiac strategy, it was very new at the time. It kind of cheated the Xyz system. It was teched as an engine in a lot of decks. It was played as a pure deck. It even combined with its main competition, which was True Draco. You could literally play a True Draco Zodiac deck. It was crazy. And these are all, to varying degrees, examples of Tier 0 decks. You can argue the specifics if you want, but that's kind of what we're just going to go with for now. So, there are obviously some good points and some bad points about a Tier 0 deck. You might be thinking there's only bad points, and we're going to go over them first, but I do think that there are some potential good points. Now, first, not great thing about the idea of a Tier 0 deck. I would say the biggest is that, well, there's not really deck diversity, so people don't usually like that, right? Most people point to deck diversity as a symbol of like how healthy the game is at the time, right? Like, oh, okay, if any deck, or not any deck, but a wide variety of decks can enter a tournament and do really well and win, then that sort of means that the game is healthy. Lots of different decks are viable. It feels fun. People want to see a lot of diversity in, the competitive game. I think that's not a bad thing to want. So if a deck is completely stomping out everything underneath it, then everyone's probably playing that deck, and that means that going to events seems kind of boring, reading event results feels kind of boring, building new decks that could potentially stop the best deck feels kind of hopeless. So yeah, deck diversity is something that people usually like, and a Tier 0 format would take that away from you. Also, just as a kind of more general thing, if a deck is better than every other deck, then you're always fighting an uphill climb. It turns into this kind of like if you can't beat them, join them thing. Nobody likes facing bad matchups, but it sucks if that's the matchup you're always going to play and it's like extremely, extremely uphill and just feels almost impossible to beat. This deck always has the answers. It's always faster, it's always stronger, it's always more reliable, it can always recover. It feels like it plays around its counterplay. It just feels hopeless. So that's not fun. Nobody likes, sort of polarizing or just over-centralizing decks. And also, and you could call this one of the good things or bad things, but just the fact that everything centralizes around that deck, all the discourse, everything, that's not cool, right? Or seemingly so. Another thing is that it's a very popular buzzword. You've probably heard some of your favorite YouTubers use it as a great clickbait title, right? Is this going to be the next Tier 0 deck? These Tier 0 unstoppable strategies. This deck is unbeatable. It's so crazy. It's so insane. And I think that word carries a lot of like kind of fear and excitement and paranoia. Like, is this actually going to be the next Tier 0 deck? Do I have to worry about this? And like, whatever, should I buy it? Should I be playing it? Like, what am I going to do? And people really like freak out around it. It's a buzzword. It gets clicks. It starts conversations. It gets people chatting on Reddit and on Discord and on Facebook and wherever. So, yeah. Seems like Tier 0 decks and formats, if they are real, are not a great thing, but I do think that there are some small benefits to the idea of this existing. And these are kind of more fixated on like the competitive space, right? So I am not like won a YCS. I'm not like a professional Yu-Gi-Oh player or anything, but I have played competitive Yu-Gi-Oh for many, many years, and I've topped my fair share of like regionals, gotten some invites here and there. And, I think that something that is a little bit more beneficial on the competitive side of things to a format that only has one or maybe two like super strong dominant decks is actually preparation. So if you're only going to be facing one deck in an entire event, or maybe one or two decks, it's very easy to prepare for them. Playtesting becomes a lot more straightforward because you can just, prepare yourself for that one deck because that's all you're really reasonably expected to face. And also, preparing your side deck or preparing main deck techs becomes a lot easier. If this is the deck that you're going to face, then it's easy to commit a lot of spaces in your side deck for it, like 10, 12 spots in your side deck, maybe even all 15 cards. Same if you're kind of considering, if you're on the fence about teching this really spicy, like, good anti-meta tech card in your main deck that you might normally side, but you're like, okay, I kind of want to main deck this. That's risky to do in a format where there's like a bazillion different decks to play. But if there's only like one deck that you're reasonably expected to face, then maybe you could tech, these extra hand traps or this other like, floodgate trap or whatever it is that makes that matchup easier. And so that's something that's really cool. I also think that actually let me give an example of that. So like in 2019, kind of the later half of 2019, the big decks to beat were like Orcust, Sky Strikers, Thunder Dragons, Salamangreats to some extent. Most people agree that Orcust was the best deck of them. Now, it wasn't like a Tier 0 situation, but it was pretty clearly like kind of the leader of the pack. At the time, I was playing the Gren Maju Castle deck. And so this deck main deck Super Poly, and that's like the example I'm going to kind of use here. Super Polymerization was a really strong card against the Orcust deck in particular because they ran nothing but dark monsters, and Super Poly is unreactable and a bunch of other things that make it kind of nutty. But anyways, I really enjoyed the Orcust matchup because I actually found it to be one of the easiest matchups for me personally when I was playing the Gren Maju deck. Now, did that make the Gren Maju deck the best deck in the format? No, clearly not. And it didn't mean that like it was necessarily an easy win at every single event, but the fact that I had a good and like favorable matchup, or at least a comfortable matchup against the best deck in the format meant that I kind of got to breeze through a lot of rounds that other people might have struggled with. That said though, it still was not a perfect solution because my deck had a lot of trouble against, say, Altergeist or Sky Strikers, which were equally like there was an equal chance that you might just see one of those compared to seeing Orcust. And so like because it was a diverse format, it meant that I couldn't just rest on my laurels and be like, well, my deck does well against the best deck, so I'm fine. It wasn't always the case. So that's kind of one of those examples. Anyways though, another sort of benefit to a sort of one deck, two deck format or Tier 0 format or whatever is actually that even though it kind of seemingly stifles innovation, I actually think that it sort of invites innovation. It means that everyone is looking at that deck and everyone is practicing that matchup. So the dynamics of the matchup change very rapidly. Now, if you're the type of person who maybe just plays like at locals or just kind of on EDO Pro, this might not matter as much to you. But I think that people who go to like YCSs every other week or like regionals every week can actually attest to the fact that the metagame does shift very subtly, like week to week, event to event. The same tech cards that were working really well last weekend might not necessarily be the same this weekend, and people will make decisions and calls on like what they choose to run, how they choose to play out combos, how they choose to side deck based on what those trends are. So like let's say in the Sprite example that people, like right now people are saying Ghost Ogre and Psyframe Gamma are some of the best hand traps to use against sprites because of how they interact with the Link monster. I won't get into the details here, but so those are the popular kind of hand traps that people are saying you need to be running against sprites right now. Let's say then that sprites adapt their combos and common sort of lines of play to handle those like hand traps, or they start main decking more answers to those hand traps. Then that means you might have to find a new solution to how sprites have adapted to the first set of hand traps. And then sprites will adapt to that. And it can go on for a long time. But what could even end up happening is that it circles back in on itself, and the original cards that were good, or like the strong sort of tech picks against that deck, are now actually just as good because like we've played this rock, paper, scissors thing, and it's fun. I think a lot of people who are really interested in like how metagames evolve and getting into the real nitty-gritty weeds of that, this can be really cool. But again, it's not something that like everybody's going to necessarily notice or care about, and it doesn't make the fact that it's still like a tier 0 deck any like better for people. I think a third thing is that it actually makes it more exciting when other decks do well, because if there's like a clear top dog, a clear deck to beat, and everyone else is the underdog, then it means that upsets are just a lot more exciting. If randomly, a like Ogdoadic deck or a Rika deck or a Magic-y deck or something suddenly like won a YCS, I think that you'd see loads of eyes on it. It would kind of explode and like be just very, like everybody would be talking about it. Now granted that kind of already still exists now. Like if you look at Despia and Sword Soul, those are like some of the best decks in the current format up until now. But if another deck ends up winning, then people still talk about it and there's still a bit of buzz. But I think that a tier 0 format kind of further like pushes that, sort of like augments that idea that a low tier deck couldn't possibly win. So if it does, it's got to be a big deal. So yeah, now those might not be the most convincing arguments, and I'm not here to tell you that you should love tier 0 formats or that Konami should make more of them. I don't think so. I mean, it's still probably more bad than good, but I just wanted to, raise some points that might like change your mind, or just kind of they're interesting things to think about and talk about. Whether or not this next set of decks will be tier 0, again, I don't know. They seem to be in Japan, but I think that Yu-Gi-Oh players really vary a lot. The United States and North America and just the entire TCG territories have different players with different styles of deck building, different styles of play and side decking and mentalities towards things. And sometimes this sort of thing can kind of cause like tier 0 decks that were meant to be to just not happen. And another sort of, I guess we just say like silver lining is that you probably don't actually have to worry about a tier 0 deck at your locals necessarily. Like tier 0 decks are typically expensive, and the very competitive crowd is oftentimes drawn to them. But many cases, like your locals isn't going to really change that much. A lot of people just play what they play because they like it, and that's just that. So you might not actually have to worry about it. So don't feel like too threatened by the idea that like a tier 0 deck exists and it's going to ruin everything and it's like the doom and gloom of Yu-Gi-Oh! Maybe not. Okay, I've gone on long enough, but hopefully this was an interesting discussion. I want to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments. What exactly defines a tier 0 deck? Because that seems nebulous. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Are we about to see one or not? Yeah, okay, that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Pass turn.